personal repertoire for the church, but
We've never sang that one here.
I've led it before when I did it on guitar.
Okay.
Yeah, I love that hymn. If you have a Bible and you find it helpful to follow along, please turn in it to Romans, the 4th chapter. This is where we'll spend our time today. Some of you in this room may know this name. His name is Blaise Pascal. A mathematician who became a Christian late in life as an adult, a genius really when it came to scientific, philosophical, and mathematical knowledge. As a matter of fact, there's a computer language named after Pascal. That's where it comes from. And yet, he, like Sir Isaac Newton, spent more time writing about Christianity than he did writing about his specialty, which was mathematics, which is just fascinating. Sir Isaac Newton, of course, gives us all the understanding we have in physics of large objects and how they interact. He and Leibniz gave us the calculus. Imagine. They gave us a mathematical way to represent shapes that couldn't be represented any other way. Geniuses. And yet, both Leibniz and Newton and Pascal gave us more relative to Christianity than they did relative to their discipline. I think that's fascinating. But Pascal wrote something that is probably the most popular of his writings, which is known as the Pensées, which is literally his thoughts. He used to walk around with a slip of paper, and he wrote things down as they occurred to him, and they were collected by his sister after his death and collected into this thing called the Pensées, his thoughts. And here's what he says, and I love this description of humanity because of its biblical accuracy. So listen very carefully. I wish I'd have thought of it. He says, what a chimera then is humanity. Now a chimera, if you don't know what that is, that's a monster. They're a chimera in the Bible. It's where you take, say, one of the descriptions you might find in the book of the Revelation, where you've got a lion's body, a person's head, a scorpion's tail, wings, the feet of a bear, all these different, and you can plug in any thing you want. It's a monster, a chimera. He says, what a chimera then is humanity. What a novelty, what a monster, what a chaos, what a contradiction, and yet what a prodigy. Judge of all things, and yet imbecile worm of the earth. Depository of truth, yet a sink of uncertainty and error. The pride and the refuse of the universe. Who will unravel this tangle? Now, people who hear this for the first time, especially those who do not believe, will bristle at this. And I can understand they're being offended by it. However, all we have to do is look at the 20th century to see that Blaise Pascal and the Bible get it exactly right. Who can explain the kinds of cruelties that were human beings given to do to other human beings during the 20th century and not say this description is absolutely correct? The most educated country on the earth, which was Germany in the 30s, became the purveyor of the worst cruelties we've seen in history practically. I can't think of anything more cruel than what they did and the reasons that they did what they did. So he's exactly right. Solzhenitsyn, the great Russian writer who spent decades in the Gulag from 1945 going forward, said this. He said, evil is not something out there. Evil runs right through the center of every human heart. I think he's exactly right, and the Bible agrees with him. So with that in mind, let's take a look at our text in Romans chapter 4. I'm going to begin reading in verse 1. However, I would advise everybody that if you really want to understand the context of the reading for today, it would be to read the first 8 chapters of Romans. That is the context. We're just taking an extraction from it. So, Romans chapter 4, verse 1. What then shall we say of Abraham, our ancestor, according to the flesh, that he has discovered regarding this matter, which is a comparison with the law and the lack of a law? If Abraham was declared righteous by the works of the law, he has something to brag about, but not in front of God. What does the scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. Now, to the one who works, their pay is not credited due to grace, but due to an obligation. But to the one who does not work, but believes in the one who declares the ungodly righteous, their faith is credited as righteousness. So even David himself speaks regarding the blessedness of anyone to whom God credits righteousness apart from works. Blessed are those whose lawless deeds are forgiven, David says, and whose sins are covered. Blessed is the one against whom the Lord will not count sin. Is this blessedness then for the circumcision or also for the uncircumcision? For we say faith was credited to Abraham as righteousness. Well, then how was it credited to him? Was he circumcised at the time or not? No, he was not circumcised, but uncircumcised. As he received the sign of circumcision as the seal of righteousness that he had by faith, while he was still uncircumcised, so that he would become the father of all those who would believe, but have never been circumcised, that they too could have the righteousness credited to them. He is also the father of the circumcised, who are not only circumcised, but who also walk in the footsteps of the faith that our father Abraham possessed while he was still uncircumcised. For the promise to Abraham or to his descendants that he would inherit the world was not fulfilled through the law, but through the righteousness that comes by faith. For if they become heirs by the law, faith is empty and the promise is nullified. For if the law brings wrath, because where there is no law, there is no transgression either. Now, this is a very dense theological statement. And again, I would encourage everybody, if you want to really unpack this well, we're not going to be able to do it fully today, to read the first 8 chapters of Romans, because that unpacks it almost completely, such that it becomes very clearly understandable what Paul is saying here. But he's making simple comparisons. He's comparing wages and a gift. That's all. And clearly, to say something is a wage, that means it's been earned. Something that is a gift is something just given and received and not earned. Very simple comparison. But there are 3 principles that emerge from this text that I want us to think about as we think about the writing here that Paul gives us. And I'm going to funnel it down at the very last, which is my way usually, and so that we can make the point that I'd like to make today. Principle 1, it's better to obey, and yet disobedience will be forgiven. Now, our very natures toward obedience in almost any form betrays us constantly. Totally. We say, for instance, we come here, we sang that hymn, Fairest Lord Jesus. We sing hymns like that all the time. We lay ourselves at your feet. We bow before you. All this language, and I'm not saying that we're saying things that are wrong. What I'm saying is, what do we do before we get going? How do we talk about ourselves and the things around us? We say, I'm going to start my day. I'm going to go to my house. I'm going to drive my car. I'm going to do my job. I'm going to go to my church. We're belying what we say is true. We lay ourselves at his feet, but we talk about everything as though we own it. So we toy with this sort of thing. I don't mean to be accusatory, because I'm the same way. We toy with the idea that Jesus is Lord, but we do it kind of unconsciously. We're not aware most of the time that our very language is telling us something very deep about ourselves that we're not in contact with most of the time. Paul makes it so clear in this first 8 chapters that sin rests on a singular choice and a series of them that carry on with us through the rest of our lives. So this comparison he makes between the law and a gift is a very subtle one. He's not saying that there's no law. Nor is he saying that the uncircumcised have no contact with the law. If you read the first 8 chapters, you'll see that Paul says the Gentiles function as though they have a law unto themselves. It's written on their hearts. They understand that there are things that are right and wrong. They understand that there's actually a law, a moral law that is there. It's real. It's not just something that we contrive and on a sheet of paper write down rules. And he's saying that all of us have an unconsciousness of it. We just aren't thinking about it like that. It was something that was given, that we possess within us as given, intrinsically as human beings. It's not something that we work to understand necessarily. We simply are given the law. And it tells us something very significant on the basis of this text. We're real different from God. We're just really different from God in terms of his righteousness. I mean, look at the whole history of Israel. What is the history of Israel? It tells us that the principle it's better to obey is a good one. And they didn't obey. The whole history of Israel is one of cresting and falling between obedience and rebellion all the way up to the time of Jesus and even during Jesus' time on the earth. Some people believed him. Some people wanted to kill him before he raises Lazarus from the dead. And what does it say? The Pharisees got together to see how they could kill him. What kind of reaction is that? Principle 2. Humility is better than self-reliance. Now, what does this even mean? I mean, think about it in terms of what Paul is saying here, that faith given to us, righteousness is handed to us, credited to us as a gift. Not something that we can earn. It's not a wage that we earn. I think this is the hardest principle for a lot of people to grasp, and they resist the gospel because of it. If you're a 2-year-old or 3-year-old and you come into the kitchen and you want the cookies, and the cookies are on the top shelf, you know your place in the world. You can't get the cookies. You have to ask somebody for the cookies. We as human beings think of us in relationship to God. How am I going to how am I going to make myself humble? I can't. As soon as I think that to myself, what does it mean? It means I've got something to do with it, right? I'm working at it now to be humble. It's not possible. Why do you think it is that Jesus, when he walked the earth, the Gospels say the poor listened to Jesus with gladness? Why do you think that is? They had nothing to lose. They knew their place in the world, you see. That's why he also said it's hard for the rich to enter the kingdom of God, because they think they know their place in the world as well. It's so hard to release the idea that we've got something to do with all this. Humility, I mean, just think about the word, the term. I'm going to say it doesn't mean what we think for the most part. Because as soon as we try to contrive it, it becomes a source of pride. The minute I think myself working to be humble, I'm now proud of the fact that I'm working to be humble. There's no avoidance of it. And so the real thing has to flow from something outside me. If it's real, if I'm really humble, it flows from the fact that somehow I've been given a glimpse of myself as I really am in front of God. That's how humility comes. That's why when Paul, in this very same set of verses, says God, when he judges, his wrath is justified, is because that difference is very real. God can judge. God can send wrath to anybody and be utterly right in doing it. So the only way to have humility is to what? There's only one way. To ask God for it. That's the only way it comes. And what's going to happen when we ask God for it? I mean, let me just give you an example here as to how I know this is not who we are. We are not humble. You know how I know that? Think of, and that includes me. I'm not saying you, I'm saying us. Think of the political leader that comes to your mind whom you despise the most. Just pick one. I don't care who it is. Just put it in your head. Don't raise your hand and say one. Just think, what is the political leader right now, contemporary to our situation, that we would say we despise the most. Because we what? We disagree with them, right? We disagree with what they're doing, what they're saying, what they're promoting. What about grace for them? What about grace for them? They fall under the same set of circumstances we do. They fall under the same humanity that we all have. And so they deserve grace just like we deserve grace. And that is, we don't deserve it at all. We don't deserve it at all. We just ask God for it, right? The final principle is this one, and this is, I think, the one that sums the other two up. The other two rest on this principle. And this comes again straight from the text. That principle is brokenness. Now, just think to yourself, who's going to sign up for that? Who was going to sign up for brokenness? I can't think of anybody. I don't think if somebody handed me a sheet of paper and said, here, if you want to be broken, put your name on this sheet of paper and turn it in, I'm probably not going to put my name down. And what is brokenness, biblically speaking? That's a big question. One writer says it this way. I wish I'd have thought of it, but I don't think this even fully captures it. But the writer says this: when the pain of life destroys my confidence in my ability to make life work, when it exposes as intolerable the insubordinate arrogance in my demand to feel good, that is the experience of brokenness. That doesn't sound cheerful at all to me. I mean, if that were the picture, what if we change the name of this church to the Church of the Broken? I mean, it's just not attractive, is it? It doesn't sound like a place where people want to come. Why does the believer's life have to include, and I say it does, have to include this aspect? It's because of several reasons. One of them is we're no longer innocent. And everything about who we are has edges that need to be rubbed off constantly, just constantly. And the second is we are always sliding toward our habitual selves. Now, you may think to yourself, well, I'm not. Well, I bet you if we follow you around for a week or two, we'll find all kinds of places where we are sliding toward our habitual selves. Do you know what? The letter to the Hebrews, for instance, beautiful passage. It speaks to us about what it calls, and in most translations it says, drifting. Do you know what the word there is? The word there is apostasia, from which we get our word apostasy. Now, apostasy sounds very bad, but it's really not. It's a word picture. It's a word picture. All it is, the word picture is this. A person is on an incline, they're climbing, and they cease to climb on a slippery incline, and guess what happens? Think what happens. If you're on an incline and it's slippery and you cease to climb, what happens? You go back, you slide back. That's where we get the term. The word apostasia is translated in some translations backsliding. That's where we get the term. That's all it is. And we are all, if we cease to climb toward God, backsliding. But how is it that we determine to climb toward God? I mean, after all, even those of us who've been walking with the Lord for a long time will look at things and say, you know, if it's easier, it's probably God doing it. If what's in front of me is easier, that's probably the one that God is showing me, that I should go that way. That may not be the case at all. Talk to any missionary and they'll tell you the easy is probably not the way that God is showing anybody to go. Every good that we enjoy on this planet is tainted with a desire for us to be happier somehow. And that makes it easy to assume that if something's good, it's better. But it's not always. Think about this for a moment. Be honest within ourselves for just a minute. We see somebody we care about suffer in some way, whatever that is. In all honesty with ourselves, what is our desire to see them not suffer stemming from? It stems from the fact that their suffering hurts me. And I don't like that pain. I want that pain to stop. And if their pain stopped, my pain would stop. So how is that real compassion for the person who's suffering? But you see, that's the best we can do. Because we are fallen. Because we are broken and messed up. And we cannot ever lose that sense of self in everything that we do. I mean, I read people who I correspond with, and they'll say something like this. They'll say, why does God punish me for Adam and Eve and what they did? What? The question answers itself. What are you trying to escape from? That God's holding you responsible for something. That's all. To throw that out there like that is to just simply try to project your flaws onto somebody else and say, why would God hold me responsible for their flaws? Well, what about yours? You know, when we begin to see that we really desire as human beings to escape God's gaze in a lot of ways, then we start to see ourselves for who we really are. There's no equality among human beings. Some people are faster, some are smarter, some are bigger, some are smaller, some are more agile, some are intellectually more capable, some are less. There is an equality, though, that humans do have. A total equality. You know what that is? We're all sinners in front of God. There we are completely equal. There's no justice in the world if there's no God, you know. We may think there's justice, but all that really is us satisfying a yin in ourselves. There's no justice. If God doesn't exist, then when we leave this world as walking up this side of the grass, then we're free from anything we've ever done. We've gotten away with it. Right? Non-being there's no threat to that at all. So there's no justice. Hitler got away with everything. He killed himself. He's free from it. But if there's a God, there is justice. Real justice. See, and then we think about it this way too. We want God to see us doing good. And we want it because we want God to reward us for doing good. We forget about the equality we have before God, as everyone is a sinner before God. That's just how it is. And we replace it with this idea that somehow we can get the gold star for showing up for Sunday school. That's why I so despise that when little kids are taught that if they'll show up for Sunday school, we'll put a gold star next to your name. It teaches them something about God that's just not true. It's not. Everybody is equal before God. We are all sinners before God. So if God is going to use you and me in who we are to bring us to the place where he gets out of us what he has built into us to do and be, how is he going to do that? There's only one avenue that he can pursue, and that's to break us. We have to be broken. Myself will not give up on itself, ever. Ever. I want what I want. I like what I like. Maybe that's not where God has us to be. Maybe that's not who he's called us to be. You know, C.S. Lewis makes this example. I wish I'd have thought of it. It's a great example. I still love them, nature documentaries. And I remember when we were living in Pennsylvania, I remember when we got the Discovery Channel. When Becky and I we'd moved into our first apartment. We had a 17-inch Sony TV that I had bought years ago. And it was in a room right outside the kitchen. And I could eat breakfast and watch nature documentaries. But the Discovery Channel was still just being offered in audio only. It was just a bunch of squiggly lines because the cable company that we were hooked into had not yet purchased the rights to the show. What a happy day when they finally did, and we could actually see what these people were talking about on these shows. And I love nature documentaries. And I remember watching several of them wherein they show how hard it is for a bird to hatch. It's a lot of work. I mean, if you and I were to do something similar, it'd be like somebody putting you in a plexiglass bubble about 3/16 of an inch thick and giving you no tools whatsoever and telling you to get out. It's a lot of work to get out of that thing. And Lewis says this, he says, the easier thing for the bird to do would be to just remain as a good, decent egg and forget about getting out. That would be easier. But if you do that, you'll rot. The bird will rot. So he says we can't just remain good, decent eggs. We've got to be hatched out. And that goes on over and over and over again, or we will go bad. We're in the process of learning to fly, a process we will not fully engage until we're on the other side of the grass. But this is where all of this funnels down for me. Brokenness is not a bad thing. Brokenness is the place where God grants me rest from myself, because I cannot change myself. I cannot change my heart. Only God can change a heart. We can pass all the laws we want to pass relative to racism or anything else, and it will never erase racism for anybody's heart, ever. It'll just make them obey the law. That's what Paul talks about when he talks about the law. It became our schoolmaster just to show us who we really are. But you and I can find rest, and it is so trivially easy to do. All we've got to do is come to God with empty hands and ask for it. That's all he asks. That we come to him like the little child who wants the cookies they can't reach. We want the righteousness of God that we cannot reach. We want to be right with him. That's what righteousness is, rightness with God. We want that. We can't reach it. But we can ask for it and God will give it. That's an awfully restful place to be. I don't know where everybody is today, but if I said anything, you got a question for me, I'll stay here as long as it takes as we close.